It's a great pleasure and privilege to introduce a long-time friend and acquaintance and distinguished social anthropologist, Polly Hill, who is going to talk briefly about life in Cambridge and her very distinguished work in Africa and India and in the Fens. So, Polly, it's delightful to have you with us, and whenever you'd like to start.
Thank you, Alan. Curiously, I start by saying that my greatest gift is that of reading poetry aloud, but no one knows this, as I am too shy to read in public. My maternal grandfather, John Neville Keynes, was a Cambridge Don, a moral scientist who became registry, who arrived in Cambridge in 1872 and kept every term, as they say, until he died 77 years later at the age of 97 in 1949, leaving behind a fair spattering of descendants associated with Cambridge University, a spattering which has meanwhile increased. My mother was born in Cambridge, as I was myself, but my claim to indigenous descent is somewhat marred by my departure for Manchester at the age of 6. However, I reappeared at Newnham College in 1933. I was automatically debarred from keeping every term thereafter by the dreadful rule that one could not be a research student unless one had a first. I got a 2-1 in economics, and only one woman, who had not even been Joan Robinson, had done better. So it was a cruel rule. In the event, I was, as a result, to wait 17 years until I entered academia through the back door of a colonial university. In 1938, I became a research assistant at the Fabian Society, financed by Frank Pattenham, now Lord Longford, and wrote a book on unemployment, which was published in 1940. This was a very boring book, but in accordance with practice at that time, it got a full-page review in the New Statesman by G.D.H. Cole. Reverting to my memories of Cambridge in the First World War, I had a bad war because Cambridge was a military centre, and my earliest memory is of Armistice Day 1918, when a terrible weight fell off my small 4-year-old shoulders. Having recently removed to central Cambridge, I am still suffering from that war. I languished as a civil servant during the war, and even more pathetically for some time thereafter. As a temporary civil servant, I fetched up in the statistics department of the Colonial Office, the corrupt head of which...
If you can keep that not
Oh, yes.
It can go up a bit.
That's all right. The corrupt head of which used to tear out pages from files when he didn't agree. One of our functions was to instruct colonies on how to guess plausible figures when, for example, they undertook those absurd agricultural censuses. The only worthwhile thing I did was to persuade the office that when a colony imported banknotes with a notional face value of £1 million, they should cease to be valued at £1 million in that poor colony's trade accounts, but should be regarded as merchandise valued at their cost of production, say £20,000. At last I resigned and became unemployed for some 6 months. My greatest stroke of luck was to be taken on as commercial editor by David Williams, the inspired editor of that weekly paper, West Africa. The Colonial Office never sent anyone to visit a colony, but David Williams did. I came to life for the first time since my childhood when I landed in the Gold Coast in December 1952. Immediately on landing, I felt I had come to a new planet and was freed from my difficult Cambridge background. My life was forever changed. It was wonderful to arrive in a colony which was leading the way towards independence in Africa, which was to be achieved there in 1957. It was an electric time. In 1953, I married a white man who happened to be stationed in the Gold Coast. And after a tussle with Cecil King, a renowned and awful predecessor of Robert Maxwell on the Daily Mirror, which owned the paper West Africa, I got the sack as a journalist. Though I recommend high-class journalism as a wonderful introduction to such a region as West Africa, I was now freed to take up research, which I continued to do in Ghana until 1965. That is to say, 12 years later, that being a year before the discredited Nkrumah fell. I felt secure in this work because the other 2 posts of research fellow in the University of the Gold Coast were always unfilled, people preferring to be lazy lecturers. However, when pregnant in 1956, I was sacked again, this time by the Vice-Chancellor of the University of the Gold Coast, who was, I regret to say, a Cambridge man. His argument was that it would be so embarrassing for him if a young man wanted my post. He didn't mention the 2 vacancies. I successfully, though painfully, fought this dismissal and was reinstated before the birth of my daughter in 1956, an event which enormously improved the quality of my professional work, a fact which I want to emphasize to the utmost of my ability. It is not the case that motherhood and intellectual work necessarily conflict with each other.
How did it help, actually? You say it enormously improved and increased.
I felt such a satisfaction in being a mother,
yes,
that I set out somehow with a renewed vigour,
yes,
into the cocoa country,
mm.
and immediately saw the point of what I was doing. I wasn't having to live away from Susanna,
yes,
because I never spent the night away.
yes,
I didn't go more than 3 days a week into the cocoa forests,
yes,
and worked otherwise in my study at home,
yes,
and had an excellent Ghanaian woman to look after her. And life was extremely satisfactory, because I had to write my notes and so on other days. And I went to different places every day. I wasn't working in one particular village.
So you think if she hadn't been born, in fact your work would have been much worse? It would have...
Oh yes, I would have stagnated. I mean, I had been working on cocoa farmers for some time before this event of the birth of my daughter occurred, and had entirely missed the point.
Being? What was the point?
The point was that the development, as I shall come to, of the cocoa growing industry was due to the migration of cocoa farmers who bought large areas of land. This was not in the books. This was one of the great events in sub-Saharan Africa, which was altogether unrecorded. I was extremely fortunate in encountering this subject.
Yes.
This happened in southern Ghana, but not in Ashanti.
Yes. Thank you.
As a married woman, I was employed on a monthly basis. Everybody else was, of course, on a proper contract. But even so, one took a long-term view of one's prospects. Nobody told me what research to do. Nobody indeed took the faintest interest. And equipped with a mileage allowance and an 8-horsepower Fiat car, I plunged into the cocoa forests. Why cocoa? Because the Ghanaian economy was almost entirely dependent on that crop, and also because the post-war interdisciplinary team in Ashanti, which had studied cocoa farmers, had published hardly anything. Meyer Fortis was much the most distinguished member of that team, and I hasten to add that his excellent chapter on kinship and marriage among the Ashanti in the book African Systems of Kinship and Marriage was in itself a sufficient justification for the existence of the team. In 1954, when I started work, little reliable research had been done on cocoa farmers as distinct from the crop cocoa, except by W.H. Beckett. But he failed to realize the significance of the migration of southern Ghanaian cocoa farmers, as most lamentably I did myself for some years, which shows the necessity of taking a long view of field research, such as seems to be almost impossible these days. In 1956, being understandably in a great hurry owing to the behaviour of the Vice-Chancellor, I produced a rather pathetic little book entitled The Gold Coast Cocoa Farmer, a Preliminary Survey, a paperback issued by the OUP. There were 10 chapters, but fortunately I think that the 3 chapters on cocoa farm labourers and another 3 on the pledging of cocoa farms are still useful. My pioneering work on the labourers was wholly ignored for some quarter of a century when some Ghanaian academics did the research again, ignorant of what had gone before. So much for the transitoriness of library paperbacks. I did field work in Ghana for 11 years, a period which was interrupted by a year in Cambridge as Smuts visiting fellow. Fortunately, Meyer Fortis had visited Ghana after independence and put forward my name for the fellowship. He was astonished to discover after my arrival that I was a Cambridge indigene. Please do not take too rosy a view of my time in Ghana. As a lowly research fellow, I never had an assistant or an office. As assistants, I relied on English-speaking Ghanaians I met in the cocoa areas, most notably men called liaison officers, the lowest level of life in the Department of Agriculture, whose duty was to befriend the farmers. These charming men, whose presence always made my arrival in any village seem respectable, were quite unsurprised by my requests for help, asked no questions, and expected and received no pay from me. I was utterly dependent also on the very expert Ghanaian cartographers in the Department of Agriculture who were mapping cocoa farms in connection with compensation for the uprooting of trees suffering from swollen shoot disease. By the way, my first principle in all my field work throughout my life has been never to ask permission from high-ranking officials or anyone else for fear it would be refused. When in Hausaland in northern Nigeria, I twice mapped the farmland using official aerial photographs, and I was never challenged. This work formed the basis of my study of economic inequality. The migrant cocoa farmers, about whom more shortly, spoke a multitude of different languages, having diverse homelands. While I partly agree that I ought to have been prevented from evolving into an economic anthropologist owing to my profound linguistic abilities, which were, however, shared by no other than W.H.R. Rivers, I yet want to add...
When you say your linguistic abilities, you mean inabilities?
Did I say disabilities, I said?
Disabilities.
I hope.
You find it very difficult to learn.
I'm hopeless. Completely hopeless, as was W.H.R. Rivers. Not that he was out for long in the bush, but I mean, he still was hopeless.
But you said that you learned German quite well and then repressed it in the Second World War.
Yes, that's true. But nevertheless, I worked with an interpreter in Hausaland for years.
Yes.
And never acquired any Hausa.
Well, maybe it's the other way around. Because you had an interpreter, you never learned any Hausa, rather than because you didn't have any Hausa, you worked with an interpreter, if you see what I mean.
I mean, the dictionary, which is a very great dictionary by Bargery, which is a kind of encyclopedia, was my constant companion.
Yes.
So I was extremely aware of the significance of the words that mattered.
Did you ever systematically try to learn the language?
Not systematically, because I knew it was hopeless.
Do you think this was a serious weakness? Or not?
No, I do not. I think it was advantageous. If you have a very good friend who is your interpreter,
yes,
the proceedings of talking to people are slowed up by the questioning process,
yes,
which is involved in interpretation, enabling one to take notes at the right pace. And I learnt this when I, much later, worked in the Fens,
yes,
where I found the people rambled on in a way which I found quite intolerable. And I could keep no order in the conversation because I could not ask them questions in the same way as I could when I was working through an interpreter. I think that there is a lot to be said for working through interpreters. And as I say, I was very interested in words. Indeed, I had glossaries and so on. But I did not speak the language. It is essential to know the words and to have the Bargery dictionary is one of the great dictionaries of the world. And I was fortunate enough to be able to obtain a copy. You must have that.
So you would be able to pick up particular words that were used?
Oh, yes, yes, yes. And I mean, I would say to the interpreter what was the word used. And so don't think that one is not taking any interest in language. One is taking a great interest in language. It's just that one lacks the ability to express oneself in the language. And I venture to think quite a number of people who think that they're good at languages miss a good deal because of their feeling that it's disreputable to work with an interpreter. I had a close friend called Rennie Pittin, a very excellent anthropologist who worked in Hausaland, who was an excellent linguist in Hausa, but she always went out with an interpreter, for which I admired her.
Right. Thank you.
The historic cocoa growing area of southern Ghana, in which land was bought by the migrants, was a hinterland lying some 20 miles north of Accra, the coastal capital of Ghana. During most of the 19th century, for reasons which are still not properly understood, this hinterland was mainly afforested and mainly inhabited by hunters. Many years later, it occurred to me that my motive in exploring this northern hinterland stemmed from my love of exploring Dartmoor in my adolescent years, which lay north of a bungalow owned by the Hill family in South Devon. Dartmoor was much the same shape as the historic cocoa-growing area. My work in the hinterland showed that it was the migrants who bought their land for cash. It was a hire purchase system, such that the bulk of the cash was paid out over a very long period of, say, 20 to 30 years, from the proceeds of growing cocoa on the purchased land. This was very interesting, but nobody has ever followed up my work on this absolutely fascinating subject. I am astonished that nobody followed up my work on the migrant cocoa farmers until all the maps disappeared in the course of time on which my work was based.
They have all disappeared.
I'm sure they must have. It was the migrants who bought their land, as I've said, for cash and paid for it over a period of 20 to 30 years in many cases, who had been responsible for creating the Gold Coast cocoa industry, nil in the 1890s, the largest world exporter in 1911. This was entirely contrary to prevailing orthodoxy, which I had earlier accepted myself, which held that A, land was never sold, of course this is true in many localities, and that B, the industry was created by indigenous food farmers, most of whom incidentally were women in the south, who inserted this crop into their existent farms. All my colleagues in the Department of Economics in the University of Ghana concluded that I was mad. My book, Migrant Cocoa Farmers, 1963, is of course out of print. The Cambridge Press is no longer interested. So I recently tried to interest two American university presses in a paperback. Both wrote back saying that they had consulted their development experts, in quotes, who said they had not heard of the book, which would not be used for teaching. It was because I knew that they would not have heard of these natives, in quotes, who undertook their own economic development, building roads as well as bridges over the river Densu that lay between their homeland and the land that they bought, that I thought that the minds of the development experts, whose premises are so seriously wanting, would be widened by a paperback. Amazingly, Gold Coast farmers hired themselves a Swiss contractor before 1914 to build 3 sturdy footbridges across the river, charging tolls. The colonial government was entirely ignorant of this indigenous development program. I am, however, glad to say that the International African Institute has come to my rescue, and that a paperback of Migrant Cocoa Farmers, which is regarded by them as an anthropological classic, although I was an economist at the time when I wrote it, will be published within the next year or two. I wrote Migrant Cocoa Farmers while I was Smuts Visiting Fellow in 1960 to 61. My gratitude to Maya Fortis is very great. Fairly soon after returning to Ghana in
Are you going to say anything later about Maya, or is that the point at which you could just say something about him when you came to Cambridge that time? What sort of person he was? How he influenced you?
Well, he was certainly a great influence on me. And I found his writings on Ashanti terribly important. And, of course, I found him so agreeable.
In what way was he agreeable?
Supportive of one's work. He was a snob, but it was rather embarrassing when he found out that I had Cambridge connections. Because he didn't know when he encouraged me to come to Cambridge that I had these connections.
When you say he was a snob...
well, he attached a lot of importance to the fact that I was Keynes, you see.
I see.
And in this connection, I can tell you that 11 descendants of John Neville Keynes, including John Neville Keynes himself, have been fellows of Cambridge colleges. So this may be a record.
Yes. And you, of course, are...
A fellow of Clare Hall.
Yes. And so, what relative to John Maynard?
John Maynard Keynes was my mother's brother.
Yes. And so Maya was a very nice man, was he? I mean, he was a pleasant and supportive...
Yes, later on, when he had married Doris, I visited him in Talensi country.
Yes.
This was in 1963. And took a photograph to which I attached much importance of the chiefs there, which he said was the best photo ever taken of the Talensi people. I'm not sure what to do with this photo.
Well, I'd love to have a copy, but at some point we could discuss that.
Yes.
Well, did you form, just to finish that, did you form any impression of how good a field worker he was from the visit? Or his fieldwork methods when you visited him in 1962? Did he live
63.
63. Did he live in a village or...?
No, he wasn't able to do that. It was a very brief return visit.
I see.
Yes, no, certainly not. I'm sure that he was a wonderful field worker.
And he spoke the language?
Oh, yes. Oh, he was a wonderful field worker. Of course he was.
Yes.
And a dedicated man. Oh, yes, I have the utmost regard for Maya.
Thank you.
Soon after returning to Ghana in 1961 from Cambridge, no one noticed that I was over 2 months late. I was fortunate enough to move from the economics department, where I was a fish out of water, to the flourishing African Studies Centre, where I was so happy to be a colleague of 2 African historians, Thomas Hodgkin, who I greatly loved, an Oxford indigene, see his book Nigerian Perspectives, and Ivor Wilkes, of Asante fame, who has just returned as an indigene to Wales. Despite Nkrumah's increasing megalomania, he did his best to destroy the migrant cocoa farmers. Life in Ghana continued to be fascinating. I worked on numerous topics, one of which related to a strange grassy hinterland to the east of Accra. An ecologically most anomalous area where cattle flourished, for there was no trypanosomiasis. The Ga men who owned many of the cattle were mainly descended from fishermen. As they knew nothing whatsoever about cattle rearing, they hired Fulani men from faraway countries to the north to look after their kraals. It was again in connection with cattle I went to that hinterland behind all other hinterlands, northern Ghana, spiritual home of Fortis, Two Goodies, and Drucker et al., and was very much surprised to find that cattle owners were very eager sellers of male animals. Some said over-eager. which was again entirely contrary to prevailing orthodoxy, and for all I know continues to be so today.
Did you write about that at all?
Yes. Those who doubt this may refer to my studies in rural capitalism in West Africa, a book published in 1970, of course, now out of print. Elsewhere in Ghana, I did a lot of work in marketplaces. In 1965, I was unfortunately obliged to leave Ghana, not because of Nkrumah, who was making life in the university very uncomfortable, but because my daughter was one of those rare people at that time who was unprotected by any kind of anti-malarial pill. I became unemployed and lived as an indigene in Cambridge. Fortunately, however, I became a research fellow of Clare Hall, unpaid. I hope that present-day younger anthropologists who are unemployed will take courage from this midlife crisis of a single parent who did not even think of herself as such. Between 1965 and 1973, when I was unexpectedly appointed Smuts Reader in the Department of Social Anthropology, my fieldwork was all done in Hausaland in northern Nigeria, to which I made several lengthy visits. 2 books, both out of print, resulted, both of them to a very large extent based on these aerial photographs I have earlier mentioned. In one of these Hausa villages, I was almost a temporary indigene, for I lived in a lovely large clay house in the centre of the village, which had been built for me. This is in fact a very unusual thing for anyone to have done in Hausaland. I do not know anyone who did it.
Who had a house built for them?
Or lived in a village doing research. They always sat in a city like Zaria and just went out into the bush. But I lived in...
Did John Peel work in that area? Or?
No, no. It was a village called Batagarawa. I was Uwa Gida Binta. Binta, the mother of a house. And I was delighted to have my daughter and niece visit me there, so I felt as though I was a proper member of the society. I was precariously supported by grants. However, I spent most of my time in Cambridge, or rather from 1969 in a house on stilts on the bank of the Great Ouse River, 14 miles away. My house was not in the fens, for to the north my hinterland consisted of a plateau occupied by R.A.F. Whitten. Alan Macfarlane thinks that he is the only member of the Department of Social Anthropology who actually lives in the fens.
From which you're now speaking. You are now in the fens, Polly.
Oh. In 1977, I was so dissatisfied with my life as an indigene, and be it admitted by the departmental craze for pseudo-Marxism, which was intent on destroying my type of economic anthropology, all the more maddening as I had been through it all before in the 1930s, that I literally fled at a moment's notice for a year's leave in South India.
When you say you've been through it all before, well, in what way in the 1930s?
The 1930s Marxism in Cambridge, as you know from John Cornford et al., was very, very strong. And so I was not a Marxist. I always admired Marxists in a very pathetic fashion and felt it was most unfortunate I couldn't make it.
Couldn't be a believer.
No, I mean, it was like admiring people who adopt a certain religion.
Yes.
And not being able
Yes.
to follow that religion yourself.
Yes.
So I knew it all before, but of course nobody else in the department had been through it before.
Yes.
And I just saw they were going through this thing temporarily.
Yes.
But it destroyed the department. It was quite abominable.
Who do you think were Marxists at that time?
Well, everybody in the terms of economic anthropology was pursuing a Marxist approach. There was no other permitted form of approach. And I'm sorry, but this was not my form of approach.
When you said Cornford, I mean, the other famous Marxists were Needham, Bernal,
Yes.
and so on.
Mm.
Did you know any of them?
No, I knew Needham by sight, and I have heard about Bernal from Dorothy Hodgkin, the famous Nobel Prize winner, who was the wife of my friend Thomas that I have earlier mentioned.
Yes.
Mm.
So it was mainly which were the Marxists who were?
Well, it was just a general atmosphere. Margot Heinemann at Newman
yes.
College was a famous Marxist, and one respected her enormously for this capacity to be a famous Marxist. She was the girlfriend of John Cornford, who, as you know, was killed aged 21 in the Spanish Civil War.
Was he? He wasn't the Cornford who wrote...
He was a member of the Cornford family. His father was the famous professor of classics.
Oh, yes.
But a very clever historian who's quite brilliant. He had an illegitimate child who's around, called Cornford, who's somewhere in academia. But he died more or less on his 21st birthday in the Spanish War.
So you fled Cambridge and went back to... You went to India?
I went to India.
Why did you go to India?
The reason I went to India was that I'd been fortunate enough to have been invited to Sri Lanka
Yes.
the year before by a good friend of mine, Barbara Sansoni,
Yes.
a famous manufacturer of cloth, which she exports in vast quantities, a very artistic and interesting woman, a Sri Lankan herself, of course. And when I got to Colombo, where she lived, I felt enormously at home. And I was really surprised by this. And it gave me a feeling that my previous experience in West Africa was relevant to the Indian subcontinent. So that was why I went to India. The authorities were very good in granting me a year's study leave.
Yes.
And it wouldn't have been any use at all, really, if I hadn't had a whole year. I was extremely lucky.
The Smuts?
Yes, I suppose so.
Managers.
Yes, because they financed me, and I mean, I paid for my assistance out of finance from the Smuts Fund and so on. And I was also lucky because at that time, when you arrived in India, you didn't have to show any visas. I was nervous about this on the plane, and when I arrived, they said, "How long are you proposing to stay?" So I said, 1 year, and showed them my return ticket. "Good," they said.
That's nice. But why Bangalore? Why that area? Was there any particular...
This was extremely fortunate. A friend of mine had suggested a certain hopeless centre, which I, in fact, had nothing to do with when I got there. They were hopeless.
Which was that? Was that the Institute for Economic and Social...
I always forget the name of these institutes. They're all more or less the same.
There's a famous one, the
yes.
Institute for Economic and Social...
Yes, that's right, and Srinivas was connected with it. That's right.
Yeah.
Now, the great merit of Bangalore and of Karnataka is that it is situated at an altitude of 3,000 feet.
Yes.
And I flourished.
Not too hot.
And so this was extremely lucky.
Why did you have nothing to do with the Institute? You just didn't find it... You wanted to be away from academics, presumably, and get on...
I arrived there, and I received no reception whatever. And Srinivas was evidently jealous of anybody who was going to undertake actual field work, and ignored me totally, although I'd had a letter of introduction from Meyer, as far as I remember.
So...
And I mean, I went to visit him soon after I arrived, and soon after I arrived in the house, the table was laid, so I thought, good, I'm being asked to supper. But oh no.
Oh, yeah.
It was like that. So I just didn't bother with this institute. The only service they performed was in introducing me to a young man, an unemployed graduate, who would assist me.
Yes.
and that unemployed graduate seemed a little miserable. So I got him to invite a friend to join our team, who was a most delightful man, who I got on enormously well with and still in touch with.
Mm.
And so I had two excellent assistants, the first one being a statistician who did excellent pseudo-demographic work in the villages. We worked in 6 villages.
Yes.
I found my study of the 6 villages in the southern state of Karnataka most interesting. We didn't live in the villages, for my 2 Indian assistants would not have been prepared to do this for caste reasons, nor would I, for that matter, for fear of isolating myself from the Harijans, the former untouchables, who were my chief interest and who lived in hovels. So I lived in a delightful colonial-style shack on the roof of a Bangalore hotel, since demolished. The book I wrote on my experiences, dated 1982, has a most unfortunate title. And as the press is unrepresented in India, it is in no Indian bibliographies. The paperback edition has been pulped by the press.
Can you remind us of the title?
Dry Grain Farming Families.
That's right.
The point being that I was most surprised to find that insofar as Indians cultivated unirrigated grain, their position was extraordinarily similar to that in Hausaland. So the book was a comparison. For instance, I showed that the farm labouring system in Hausaland was identical in all particulars, I mean in, say, 12 details, with the farm labouring system.
What sort of details, for example? Just 1 or 2 examples.
Well, the farm labourers were, on the whole, small farmers who hadn't got enough work. They, how can I put my mind back? I mean, I list in the book about 12 different points, which were all totally identical in the 2 areas. But of course, economists aren't interested in this kind of thing.
No, it fell between stools, presumably, because economists thought it was anthropology and anthropologists thought it was economics. So.
Well, it was rather unreadable, and I suppose it was a foolish thing to write a book dealing with both Hausaland and South India.
It makes it more interesting.
But anyway, I mean, insofar as economists want generalizations about farm labouring systems, they can find plenty there, I can tell you. But they don't.
Yeah. Did you, just one last question on that, did you get any impression as to whether, it's a very crude question, but the standard of living and the wealth in Africa or in India, were they roughly comparable, or one was noticeably wealthier than the other?
Yes, there were, in Karnataka, there were a small number of really quite prosperous men in villages who, on the whole, were lacking. And they had big houses and so on, you know, well-built houses, which were, on the whole, lacking in Hausaland. But I found that the pattern of economic inequality in general was not dissimilar in the 2 areas, and I took a very keen interest in the position of the Harijans.
What year was this? 1976, what did you say?
The year I went to India
78.
was, I was appointed Smuts reader in 1973, which was the year in which Jack Goody became professor. And it may have been
About 76.
Probably 76.
Because we went there 20 years later to the same area, and I wondered whether, for instance, if you went into a a village near Bangalore at that time, would you have seen cars?
Well, this is an interesting point. What they said to me at this institute was, oh, you cannot work within the shadow of Bangalore city because everybody in the villages works in the city,
Yes.
migrating. I said, I do not believe you. From my experience in West Africa, I know that if I go to a village off a main road, I shall not find this to be the case.
Yes.
And I was completely right. So I went to a lovely village called Hulahalle.
How far from Bangalore was it?
Oh, about 18 miles, I should think. And I walked over a lovely paddy field to get to it. And so I cannot answer your question because there were no cars in that village.
Yes. Were there any tube wells? Because one of the features that's very prevalent now is this use of electricity. Most of the villages have electricity.
No, we had no electricity in Hulahalle.
And so they weren't able to drive down and get the water.
No, they had the most preposterous wells, these 6 villages. They were larger in radius than this room and extremely shallow. I couldn't understand them. But of course, tanks were the main form of irrigation.
Yes.
The water flowing down and being regulated, which was a very interesting question. The water supply being regulated by Harijans who held hereditary posts. This wasn't in the literature. This was quite different from the situation in Sri Lanka, as dealt with by Edmund Leach, for instance.
So this was this, when you say it's dry grain, it really was dry grain. The irrigation or the water was for drinking water and animal water rather than irrigation water.
No, what I mean is that both forms of crop were grown in any village. Irrigated crops, irrigated by tanks.
Rice?
Yes, and that was what we call paddy there.
Yes.
Yes, and then there was also a very inferior form of millet. I never understood why it was cultivated because the yield per acre was so low, called ragi.
Right.
And that was non-irrigated, you see.
But was it the case that the choice was between very inferior ragi or nothing? In other words, it wasn't land which you could use for rice, and therefore you had to grow, or if you wanted to grow something, this was about the best you could do.
Well, I was not able to meet a botanist to understand why such a hopeless form of millet was cultivated, so inferior to the sort of millet I knew in Hauserland.
Yes.
In terms of the yield per acre. But I was never able to ascertain why that was so.
That's interesting.
I was again able to base my work, which is highly respectable, on economic inequality, on actual figures of acreages. Because, as you know, you cannot ask farmers to tell you their acreages. They do not think in those terms. Insofar as they give you a reply, it's useless. And so I spent a lot of time with my excellent assistant, Gopal, in analysing the village.
What was his surname?
Gopal, B.A. Gopal.
Oh, B.A. Gopal.
They always called each other, my 2 assistants, Mr. Gopal and Mr. Diwakar. And they always called me Madam, which I protested about. And when Susanna arrived, they called her Madam, which I protested about.
So they pretend.
To begin with, they were very shy and they used to go behind a hedge to eat their lunch. Gradually, they became less shy and ate their lunch in my presence.
Were they Brahmins or?
No.
Just
ordinary mid-caste.
Farmers.
Yes, just an ordinary. Gopal was particularly good at getting on with Harijans. He was totally unprejudiced.
Did you notice any difference in the, I mentioned the wealth, but what about the sort of personality and the character of the people as compared to the people you met in West Africa? Were they more, they'd had a much longer oppression of a caste and hierarchical system. Were they more, so to speak, repressed and quiet and subservient than the people you met in Africa?
An interesting difference between them and Hausa people was that they were very curious about my own homeland
Mm.
and would say to me, for instance, often, how many farmers are there in your village? And when they learnt there was only one, they really were annoyed.
Annoyed?
Well, yes, because it was incomprehensible.
Yes, so they showed a wider interest.
Yes, I would say so, definitely. Mm. Three languages, Tamil, Kannada and Telugu, were spoken in my village, Bhattagarawa. So whatever kind of linguist one had been, one would have had to have prepared oneself for some years before going there. Had it not been that Gopal knew all those languages, you see. So it was all right.
Yes.
It's a sort of peripheral area. Anyway, one has to beware of the hypothesis that cities necessarily expunge their hinterlands, which is what I was told at that institute, you see, the name of which I have appropriately forgotten.
Yeah.
They do not do so.
Did you get the sense that the people from the institute often visited these areas, or?
There was only one anthropologist, and he was deeply jealous of me because I bought this Fiat aged about 20 years,
Yes.
and he only had a motorbike on which he seldom went to the field, and as far as I could tell had never written anything.
And you've forgotten his name probably as well.
Yes, I certainly have. My last field trip to the rural tropics was in 1982-3, when for 3 months only I visited Trivandrum in the state of Kerala, which stands in the extreme southwest of India. Kerala is famous, as you no doubt know, for having had at one time an elected communist government, which was not the reason I wrote an article, Kerala is Different, Modern Asian Studies. Demographically, Kerala is different because, for example, the population lives dispersedly, not in overcrowded villages as in South India generally, and because abortion is freely available on demand for women with several children. Then, educationally, for females as well as for males, Kerala has most superior standards. But for me, Trivandrum at sea level was too hot, so that it destroyed the heat control mechanism of my body, finally putting paid to my tropical experiences. My father, A.V. Hill, who was a well-known physiologist who won the Nobel Prize as early as 1922, always told me that physiologists did not understand the heat control mechanism. If that is still true, it explains the ignorance of the doctors, which persist in ignoring my serious plight, brought on, as I suggest, by my prolonged fieldwork in the rural tropical world. Well, you see, the rest of this paper originally related to
Your fen work.
my work on the fens.
Would you prefer to talk about your current work on Cambridge women? Would that be? Could you briefly? Well, maybe you could summarise the fen work just in a preliminary way.
Right. Stranded on stilts on the bank of the Great Ouse River, 14 miles from Cambridge, having completed my polemical textbook of 1986, a book which is quite popular in the USA.
Remind us of its title.
Development Economics on Trial.
Yes.
The Anthropological Case for a Prosecution. This book is quite successful in the USA, but not much read, although it remains in print now and has not yet been pulped by the Cambridge University Press.
What is the theme, or what is the main indictment, so to speak?
That their premises are all wrong, and that if they would only read the anthropologists and get some of their premises right, how much more progress they would make. Now this relates only to the rural tropical world.
Yes.
Let them get on with central banking and international indebtedness and all the rest of it.
Yes.
But when it comes to the rural tropical world, they are as ignorant as infants. They think they know things. For instance, I have heard it often said that, of course, there is no inequality in the rural tropical world. Why should there be? Couldn't be more wrong. And they do not condescend to read the work of anthropologists ever. There were a couple called Bliss and Stern who ventured into India, Oxford people. They are most famous amongst economists because they actually did some field work and they actually studied farm labourers, but without any reference to anything anthropologists had ever done. I mean, I've spent years of my life studying farm labourers. But did Bliss and Stern pay the faintest attention to anything that had ever been done by anyone else? No, they were grand pioneers in a new field and derived an enormous reputation from this.
Best to forget. What other indictments? I mean, when you say the premises, firstly, they were wrong about inequality. Were there other central premises of economics which were totally inapplicable to the rural tropics? What about the maximising theory based, I suppose, on classical economics of Adam Smith and so on, that men will seek profit above all other goals or goods? Was that the sort of thing you challenged, or the rationality, supposed rationality of, or irrationality of peasants, or even the concept peasant? Did you
Well, I was much taken up with the fact that I cannot abide the word peasant.
Yes.
Because it implies that all these people are merely subsistence farmers,
Yes.
which indeed they were not.
Yes.
And you cannot say who is a subsistence farmer because they themselves don't know if they're going to be growing enough grain to see them through to the next harvest or not.
Yes.
And the concept of a subsistence farmer is totally rickety.
So they were all, what you're saying is that almost everyone might well be involved in a money
Yes,
economy.
that's right. And it would vary from year to year who was selling grain and who was not, according to their good fortune in the year in question. And I found groundnuts, the subject of groundnuts, very interesting. Oh, I'm deviating to
No, that's fine.
Hauserland.
That's all right.
Yes. I was thinking of the question of peasants.
Did you on the question of peasants, another strand in the peasant argument, as you know, is the theory that one of the central features of peasantry, is, according to certainly the Russian school and so on, is that the unit of production and the unit of consumption are more or less the same. That it's a family labour force determined by the social family who are working together and producing and consuming together. That is what really differentiates it from a capitalist or fully market economy. Did that seem to work or not?
Well, a particular point that interested me was the independence of women in Hauserland, but not in India. The position of women in India was parlous. Whereas in Hauserland, these women who were in Muslim seclusion were producing many goods inside the houses for sale, such as groundnut oil, and buying groundnuts from their husbands at the market price.
Really?
Yes.
Separate economy.
Separate economy. In India, alas, the position of women was very, very poor. They
Through all the castes, the same from top to bottom?
Yes. We had hardly any Brahmins in my villages because the only Brahmins had been the accountants of the villages before the position of accountant was abolished. So there was perhaps one Brahmin in each village.
you said they had separate economies in Hausaland. Presumably in India they had a joint economy, so everything that the woman could produce or do was
Yes.
automatically the husband's property.
Yes, that's right.
So there was no possibility for independent activity by the
That's
women.
right. No possibility. Mm.
In what way did this affect women? I mean, did you notice that they were very submissive, or that they were very depressed, or that they were very overworked, or that they were very secluded? I mean, how did their powerless position manifest itself?
Well, unlike the Hausa women, who don't work on their farmland because they're in Muslim seclusion, they worked on the farmland. But of course, they often live in joint families. I took a very great interest in the question of joint families. So much rubbish is talked about joint families. And saying that they're something of the past. Indeed they are not. What you have to do is to work out the proportion of potential joint families in terms of the existence of adults of the third generation.
Yes.
And the actual number. And then you see that in fact the joint family flourishes in the villages. I wrote an article on this in Modern Studies, what's it called?
Was this the case in both, or this is India you're talking about?
I'm talking about India in relation to joint families, yes.
And do you think this again had an effect on the status of women? It made them property of a joint, so to speak, property of a joint family, part of a much larger whole, and therefore they were again pushed down in their status. Is that what you were suggesting?
Yes, well, of course, the position of women is hopeless if they live with their mother-in-law. If they're a widow, they can't remarry. In Hausaland, there was something rather different. It was called being in Gandu. That is to say, the son, the married son, worked with his father but didn't necessarily live with him. And so it wasn't so restrictive. I studied farm slavery in Hausaland. In fact, I'm very proud of the work I did on farm slavery. Because I'm not an important person, the literature has paid no attention to me. M.G. Smith's findings on farm slavery in Zaria, in Hausaland, are considered the text. He's quite wrong, because land tenure in Zaria was not proper Hausa land tenure, and his understanding of farm slavery was totally incorrect. I did a lot of work on farm slavery in Hausaland, which I found quite possible, provided you speak to people who are not themselves of slave descent, but who are only too ready to speak of those who are of slave descent. Many of those who are of slave descent are unaware of it.
Yes.
But clever people who are not themselves of slave descent are only too happy to expatiate on the past history of slavery. So I did some, I consider, excellent work, but it hasn't entered the literature. It's been ignored.
Did you know M.G. Smith at all?
I approached him when I was going to Hausaland, but he was too haughty to speak to me.
Really?
Yes, I went first of all to see Darrell Ford, whose great friend he was, of course.
Yes. And what was Ford like? Was he approachable? Or?
I knew Ford because I'd been to several conferences of which he was the chairman.
Yes.
And I really don't recollect. I just know that I got nowhere. And so I had to proceed on my own.
So you never met Smith, or you just...
I suppose I did. I know I made every endeavour to meet him, and I suppose I did, but I know nothing came out of it.
Yes. I mean, you referred then, and obliquely elsewhere, to the fact that there's a kind of vicious circle, because if you aren't sufficiently whatever it is, placed in the right place in a profession.
That's right, because I had no academic job, you see. I was always on grants.
Yes. You think this is the basically, if you have a kind of niche in the centre of a professional group, then people listen to you. Because it has been noticed that sometimes this even occurs within a person's life, that is to say when they retire or when they decide to leave a job and go off. Nowadays that quite often means that your work is partly ignored after your retirement, or if you decide to become something else. This is a recent phenomenon because most of the great people, as you know, like Darwin or Adam Smith or whatever, wrote their great works away from academic positions, and that was no hindrance. But with the professionalisation of the disciplines.
Yes, that's right, you see, because I have no real student followers, because I was always a loner who's doing work in the field on her own. And so I didn't have, in West Africa or anywhere, any people who regarded me as a master.
So you didn't have a school?
No.
But you said previously, and you haven't mentioned it here, that you did take a PhD in anthropology. Was that?
Yes, it was based on my book, The Migrant Cocoa Farmers of Southern Ghana, and this is the book which Goody was the examiner for. That's why I was protesting about him calling me an economist.
I see. This was under special regulations?
Yes, I was the first person under those special regulations to take a PhD under those regulations.
I see.
This was around 1966.
You did in fact refer to yourself earlier. You said at that time I was an economist. At what time do you think you sort of began to feel, well, I'm not an economist, I'm more an anthropologist?
In the course of my work on the migrant cocoa farmers, I really began to think I was an anthropologist. But there was nothing I could do about it, except that Maya encouraged me.